I would coach a therapist to deal with a client who had shame as a major feature. I would first do, in a sense, a set of preparations with the client. And that is, does the client have an onboard toolkit to regulate their state? Meaning, do they understand if they breathe in a certain way, they can rescue themselves from falling into the pits? Do they realize that if they start shutting down, that if they squeeze their arms and get up and walk for a moment, that they will get out of that, but they still might be aggressive? Do they understand that they have a toolkit built into their body that can help them shift those states? And those would become those neural exercises that would enable that person not to be, I would say, fearful of touching that shame. So the shame is not deadly. The shame is just a disrupted feeling that it doesn't feel good, but it loses its power because the shame becomes really powerful in people's lives. And the protection of shame can be so aggressive that it can be very hurtful to loved ones around them. So what you're doing is developing a toolkit for the client to regulate their state. So if touching shame puts them into a defensive state, they can get out of it. Now, when they get out of it, you as a therapist are there giving them the cues of co-regulation. But if you try to give a person cues of co-regulation and their body is too intensely defending itself, those cues are going to be misinterpreted by the nervous system as violations of trust. And shame is often associated also with violations of trust. And what is needed is that the person has to have some resource and then has to have the ability to go to the therapist as a resource. But I'm not saying the therapist is present and compassionate and a good witness, but the client is the one that has to be doing the state regulation. So the therapist, if the therapist becomes too intrusive and the client is destabilized, that intrusiveness will result in greater destabilization and reactivity. So the issue is that the therapist has to be present, has to have cues that are non-evaluative, and has to allow the client to regulate the states, to experience them. And part of the therapeutic model is to allow the client to talk about their visceral, their bodily experiences as they visit these states.